Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to a very special bonus episode. This week we have with us Lisette Sutherland. Hey Lisette, welcome to the
Vasco.
show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Lisette is the author of the book on remote work, the book titled Work Together Anywhere. She's also a keynote speaker, workshop facilitator, and a remote working champion for individuals, teams, and managers. So Lisette, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you come to embrace this whole idea of remote work and not only embrace, but you became a world-leading expert on the topic?
Yeah, every time somebody says champion, I always hear in my head like do 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 do, like this little thing goes on. Like champion. What is that? No, I mean, it really did start 20 years ago when I was living in Los Angeles, and I worked at the time for an online project management tool, and which was very uncommon 20 years ago. So it's, we have hundreds and hundreds of these tools now, but 20 years ago was different. And the tool was special, one, because it was new at the time, but also because the owner of the tool was building it because he was trying to get longevity scientists together to solve the problem of aging because he didn't want to die. So that was my first aha moment.
That's
of like,
a motivator right there.
Right. And he's still alive, by the way. So still going strong. But it opened up. I had a vision at that time. When I saw it, I was like, oh, what else could we do? And just actually recently before that, I had heard an interview about a Stanford program that took all kinds of different subjects and put them together and took perspectives from all different areas. And that was a new program at the time that they were trying. And so it occurred to me, what else could we do if we took away distance? What else could we work on? What other subject matter experts could we get together collaborating? So down the rabbit hole I went. And then to add to that experience, a couple of years later, I was able to go on tour with my favorite band because I was able to work remotely for this tool that was available 20 years ago. So it was, I had the experience of, I can see what else people can do. And I actually got to go on tour and keep my job so I could work during the day and then be, the tour manager at night. And it was just really the best time of my life.
Absolutely. So that sounds like an exciting avenue into learning about remote work. I'm guessing from the story that you didn't start with that idea, but it came to you once you started going on tour and you realized that it's possible to work with this team that is building the project management tool while also being somewhere else, right?
Well, for the company, one of my jobs was learning about other project management tools. And so naturally, I just started interviewing people about how they were working and what they were working on. It was just out of sheer curiosity. One, it was part of my job, but also I was curious. And then at one point, somebody said, hey, why don't you start a podcast? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm already interviewing people. And podcasts weren't that popular. I mean, they were catching on 10 years ago, but it wasn't like today. Everybody has a podcast. And I thought, oh, yeah, sure, that's a good idea. I'll start a podcast. And then somebody said, why don't you write a book? And then why don't you start a workshop? And it just sort of, I didn't intend, it wasn't a vision. It just sort of happened based on the need of the market. And then the pandemic hit and,
Yeah, and then everybody went remote from one day to the other.
Yeah, jetzt geht's los. We were.
It was totally a need for everybody. Now, you also work and train teams and companies all over the world. So what did you see were, and perhaps are, the key challenges that companies are facing today when it comes to embracing remote work?
Well, one thing that everybody seems to miss is all the osmotic conversations, right? The overheard conversations. So there is some information sort of dissemination that's not happening as naturally as it did before. I would just say it's happening differently now, right? We have to look at it differently. So there's that people are struggling with. I would say meeting overload, communication overload, that sort of a thing, because the studies show, they say on average, we have about 7 work applications sending us notifications at any given time.
I always switch them off, by the way. Like I couldn't work if I accepted notifications.
I don't understand. Right. I turned them off years ago. I don't understand how people work with them on at all. But indeed. So, but it is overload. And now that we can work anywhere, people are tending to work anytime, all the time, everywhere. Right. So burnout is really an issue. So I think I guess that's the core of the problem, is that burnout. And then the third thing that people are struggling with is just bonding.
What do you mean by that?
It seems like people feel like there's a lack of team building or a lack of closeness with their colleagues, that it's just, you're not accidentally bumping into somebody anywhere. So that spontaneity is a little bit gone. My personal view is spontaneity is a little overrated. But
I was going to say that when I think about this closeness or bonding, as you described it, I'm thinking that prior remote work being the norm, which it was during pandemic at least, and it still is for many companies, prior to that, I think maybe the office was a great place for extroverts because they got energy from interacting with people. And the introvert's life was harder, but nobody was really talking about it. There was even a famous book that came out some years ago that kind of opened up the whole topic of introvert versus extrovert and how to organize work for them. And now maybe we went to the other extreme, where we have, like, the introverts are thriving because they can manage their time and their energy, while the extroverts are probably feeling depressed and disconnected.
Yeah, it is exactly the same. That's why I think the future of work is choice. I'm not here to promote remote. I'm here to promote remote first, right? Work where you are most productive. And sometimes that's at the office. And I really am reminded of this all the time, because my husband really genuinely does not like to work from home. He likes being in a place with other people. He specifically goes to offices just to be with other people. So I know that there's a real need for that out there. But I think what's happened now, though, is that the world has changed. And regardless if you really love working in the office or not, the world is going to become remote first moving forward, because that's what we're seeing happen. I mean, office rates aren't coming back up. People want freedom.
Absolutely. And that freedom will manifest itself in many different ways, right? Like, so one of the things that is going on now is now that pandemic is over, we have a very lively debate, including with, major news outlets writing and publishing speeches and messages by CEOs about this going back to the office phenomena. And we are starting to see that some companies are mandating going back to the office, right? There's a whole thing about productivity. Let's not go through that rabbit hole, because that's a much bigger rabbit hole. You have a lot of experience with remote work, and of course also with companies that work remote. How do you see that debate of going back to the office versus not going back to the office from your point of view as an expert on the topic?
I have to admit, I find it entirely confusing. We just had 3 years of people proving that work could be done remotely. And the mandates for coming back to the office, I guess I'm confused, because there must be something else behind it besides productivity. They're saying it's productivity, but I feel like there must be something else, because it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't entirely understand it myself. I think it's a combination of things. As some companies, some company cultures really are better in person. I saw this as an example at my husband's startup hub after the pandemic, or when the pandemic started ending. You could see some companies came back even though they didn't need to, and it's just that they enjoyed being together. So I think there's some amount of that. Like there might be some office space mandates or downtown mandates. I'm not sure, things like that I don't know about. But these mandates, what it's leading to is absurd behavior. We're starting to see things like coffee badging, where people are checking in, they're badging in, grabbing a coffee, and then going home to get work done. But like, they had to at least show that they checked in, because the mandate was that they come to the office. So we're starting to just see some absurd behaviors in that. So I guess confusion, but also an acknowledgement that team building really is suffering for many companies, that their culture really is suffering for many companies, and that they may have been productive during the pandemic, but they have not made a proper switch to remote first.
And what does that mean? Let's take the example of like a software team that's most of our audience here. They were working all co-located before the pandemic. Then they spent 3 years working remote because it was mandatory. And now they're kind of in this debate. Should we go back to the office some days, all days? Do we mandate, don't mandate? Like, how does that look like? Like, how can a team even work through this I guess confusing, but also conflicting set of interests?
Indeed. The only way that I really know how to do this is just creating an agreement together with the team. It goes back to team agreements. But team agreements don't have to, some team agreements look like handbooks, like the GitLab's team agreement. But I just spoke on the podcast with a woman who is a digital nomad. And so she moves around quite a bit. And so do many members on our team. Their team agreement looks like a meeting every Monday where they discuss availability and what their schedule is going to be like for the week. So they sort of re-agree every week on their team agreement. And so I think as we're navigating the mandates and what people need, we have to think about like, what are we using the office for? What is the purpose? Because if you're going into the office and working at a workspace that is not as good as the one that you have at home, what is the point?
And also for others, it might be the opposite, right? Like the office provides a work environment and atmosphere that is much better than being at home. I realized this because many of the people I interviewed also on the podcast were talking to me from their kitchen or their bedroom, right? And that's not necessarily the best place to work from, right? If you don't have all of the things that you need there. Some people might have problems with internet
or kids, right?
Or kids right?
At home, like real life parents,
But
pets,
your own company is also remote. What are some of the things that you have found in your company, so collaboration superpowers, that have helped you bridge that feeling of, or the lack of feeling of being a team? What are some of the strategies and techniques you've used and benefited from to feel like a team, even though you're all remote?
Well, it's interesting because my core team is very small, and we're all remote. We've always been remote. In fact, I've worked with Mariah for almost 10 years now, and we have never met.
Physically, you mean?
Physically, right. Yeah, we talk on video all the time. Like we know each other really well. I know all her birds and her kids and all that stuff. But we never physically met. And we've struggled with team building over the years quite a bit. So in the beginning, we had Monday morning meetings that nobody liked. So we switched to Tuesday. Then we were trying to minimize the meetings for everybody. So I first would meet with Tahira, and then Mariah would come in. We'd have a few minutes of overlap, and then Mariah and I would continue. And then it turns out that Mariah and Tahira were kind of missing each other. They weren't feeling a sense of togetherness because they didn't see each other that often. So then we started experiment with team meetings. And somehow it still wasn't quite, and we talk all the time throughout the week, and it still wasn't quite the thing that was working. And eventually we've landed on virtual co-working together.
What is that virtual co-working?
So most people understand like an online meeting where you get together, you go through your agenda, but actually Mariah and I now get together and we just work together. So we open up a Zoom call and we'll discuss like, what are you working on? What am I working on? Sometimes we have something we're doing together, sometimes not. And then we just work together. We decide what we're going to do. Then we check in with each other. And, there's like a bit of banter that goes back and forth every once in a while. It's like, you're sitting next to somebody at the office. That's basically what it feels like. It's just that we're each in our own comfortable, very comfortable home offices. So that makes it quite luxurious. But it really does replicate the being together in a room and working together. I actually did this with a woman for 9 years, a woman in California. I did eventually meet her in person once. It's funny. And we did this for 9 years, and that's sort of where I got the idea. But it occurred to me with Mariah that this is better than a meeting because it's not just getting in and out. This is just us hanging out together and working. And that has created the sense a greater sense of team somehow for everybody, even Tahira, because Tahira seems to get joy in seeing us kind of hanging out. And we, of course, inform her of what we're doing in the meeting. And so, yeah, those, I think that there is a more creative way of team building than just like the pizza parties and quiz nights, icebreakers. Like if you want to be together, well, then there's lots of ways of being together. You just don't have to be physically face to face.
So I imagine that if I were to start this in my team, I would first have like a discussion with the team. Hey, how about if we try this? But what other things should I take into account before I, try out virtual co-working as a potential way to increase the feeling of togetherness and belonging with the team?
Well, one is it can feel incredibly social. It's I have to. So I did virtual co-working, and we used a tool at the time. It was Sococo, it was a virtual office, and so I had a team of people that was always in there. It was just freelancers from all over the world, and it was overwhelming for me. It was overwhelming just to see. You could see where everybody was if they were getting together in the social room or if they were working separately, and I found it really distracting. Like I couldn't concentrate on my own thing because I was so busy just looking at what people were doing. So I would say that that is a tendency. That's something to think about. Another thing is it can be overwhelming to have the video on. So sometimes you want to turn the video off, but just have the sound on so you can hear each other. You can hear each other typing or say something. So that kind of simulates sitting like back to back or something. I don't know, or like in a next cubicle or something. Um, and then I would say that what this also does is that there are other etiquettes to think about. There are new office etiquettes that you might not think about. For example, when I used to work with Gretchen, the woman in California, well, we'd be just working. We'd do this for hours a day, 4 or 5 hours a day. And, eventually one of us would go up and go to the bathroom. And then, of course, you're gone for a few minutes. And then you'd come back and all of a sudden you'd say something out loud and it would scare the
But Jesus out of
dickens out of the other person because it had been silent for like 7 minutes or something, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, I'm back. So the new etiquette was when you came back, you'd have to say, I'm back, like really quietly. So, you're like, oh, okay. So, things like that, like it really does change the etiquettes around how you work. So just be prepared to establish new ones.
And to discuss that, right? Like I also remember this was way before pandemic. We had a team and the team was remote. So half of the team was in an office in Switzerland. The other half was in an office in Poland. And we also had that problem of, not feeling connected, not knowing what's going on. And we tried something that was like completely crazy. At the time, we had an online meeting that was always on. There was a big screen in the room that showed the room to the other team, right? And there was a speaker in the middle. And of course, the people on the other side, they could always mute the sound if they wanted, right? Like they can just, switch off the sound and not listen to it. But because we had the camera on, they could see when we were gathering around the speaker, and there were a speakerphone. And we had like some technical problem we needed to solve. We all got together around the speakerphone in Switzerland, and we were discussing what is going on. And the guys in Poland, they saw us, they put the sound on, and in the middle of the conversation, they just came into the conversation,
Awesome.
Almost like a Star Trek, teleportation kind of device. And that really triggered me to think that actually, this osmotic communication can be achieved even in remote teams if you just have the right cues in place, right? For us in that team, we had a camera on so they could always see the team room because, part of the team was in Switzerland. They could always see the team room and they could see when we were gathering together and talking around the speakerphone, which we had agreed, that was a team agreement. We would always have shared conversations around, right? So we wouldn't have the conversation the other side of the room. We would go to the speakerphone and talk there. And that really triggered in me the idea that we can build a sense of shared reality and osmotic communication if we really think about it and put, the right things in place.
Totally. It's all about being deliberate and intentional and experimenting. And now, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, the technology was not what I mean, 10 years ago, we were still using Skype for Business. I don't know if people remember
Oh
how
my God.
painful it was,
It
right? I
was
mean,
almost as painful as Microsoft Teams is now.
I mean, compared to Skype for Business, it's still not great, but it's so much better than it was, right? It's usable at the moment. Like at least it's usable. Barely, barely. Okay, but that's a different tool debate. I've always hated Teams. But still,
So,
the tools now, I mean, there's no excuse anymore.
so what for us as Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, and team members in general, like we need to start thinking about how do we make this reality of remote work or hybrid work or remote first, as you call it, more productive and fulfilling. What are some of the ideas, tips, maybe even handouts you can give us that helps us with that?
Well, one, I do have a super kit which is a remote working success kit, and people can download that at collaborationsuperpowers.com/super kit. So it's super easy to remember. And with that, there's a number of different resources, from creating a personal user manual to a team agreement to meeting behaviors, a team building, a bunch of stuff in there that's useful. But one of the things you said is, how can we make the reality of remote work more productive and fulfilling? And I sort of get hung up on this word productive because I feel like we are already productive. Like we do not need to go faster and do more and fit more in. It's just that is not the issue. I think the issue is we're too productive. Like we're humans and we're not robots. So I think one of the ways of making it more fulfilling um, is using this opportunity to redesign and recreate how we're working. And it starts with one, understanding what you need in order to be productive. So that's the whole idea of creating your own personal user manual. It's not necessarily to share with others. It's more of an introspective exercise. But then also getting together with your team and deciding what is a sustainable way for us to move forward. I think that is what creates fulfillment and loyalty and team spirit, right? We're having this conversation together. I don't think we need to be more productive. Basically, I think, okay. But then there's another aspect to that, and that is one of the things I really feel like we need to do is visualize our work more in the remote setting. So, I mean, we've got all these tools, but one of the things that I learned from looking at many, many team agreements is that text is not always the right way. These documents, I've seen now team agreements that are just made out of sticky notes. I've seen the weekly agreements that are just refreshed every single week. I've seen picture agreements. So I think being creative about how we visualize our work together is an interesting opportunity, and I think it's vital for going remote. And then the leaders need to model the behavior that they want to see.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of rules placed on teams that somehow the leaders are exempt from. So there's a lot of leaders mandating that people go back to the office, but they're not doing it themselves. Like they have lives, they're people too, their kids get sick. And so then, they're also not there on the Tuesday that everybody said they would be there, So I think leaders just have to walk the talk. So if you're saying that your team, if you're telling your team that they should have good work-life balance, and yet you're sending emails all weekend long, is that promoting good work-life balance for your team? Like me,
That
if
is
you're
a good
contacting
point.
people late at night.
And because we, as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches specifically, we are also leaders. I think this is also a call to action for us to recognize that we need to show the example. Now, the example might be very simply by just listening. What does the team feel most comfortable with? What might be the things that are missing? And then taking specific and targeted action to handle those things. Right?
Totally.
Like creating that team agreement or the weekly agreement, which is another tip you just shared with us, which I think is brilliant, right? Because not all weeks are the same. And if I think about, people doing Scrum out there, if they do a 2-week sprint, part of the week is going to be focused on planning and part of the week is going to be focused on delivering. They are different things, right? And they require different focus, maybe different attention from different people in the team, and so on. So that those are definitely great tips. Now, there is another aspect, though, that I think needs special attention. Now, we are all familiar with how difficult it is to handle and resolve conflicts. And I think, also in my experience, that remote work presents an even bigger challenge in that respect, because we don't have the nonverbal communication that we would have if we were, in the same physical space. And I think we need to help Scrum Masters and Agile coaches also realize that they need to develop different skills, different approaches, different techniques to detect and resolve potentially conflicts when the whole team is remote. So what are some of the tips, ideas, experiences, stories you have to share with us when it comes to that handling of conflict in remote teams?
Well, I want to preface this by saying that this is an area that I personally struggle with myself. So I can give some tips and just recognize that I I am not walking the talk on this one myself, because I really struggle. I don't like conflict, and so I tend to run from it as much as I can anywhere possible. Except for that, there are sometimes you just have to put on your big person pants and, face the music. That's just how it goes. And so on remote teams, I think that that's something to just be really aware of, which is why it's so important to create the space for these things to come out. For some teams, it's part of the retrospective, like, you can blow steam. And I think, let me just also start by saying part of the problem is that when it's remote, every time you bring something up, it seems like a bigger deal than it actually is, because it's in writing, or there's been some time that's passed, or, so in person, you can kind of almost resolve some of the small things immediately just through body language. So remote, you have to address everything. And so that makes it particularly tough. So one, it's good to agree on the protocol as part of your team agreement for, like, how are we going to address conflict when it happens? Like, when I used to work for Happy Melly long ago, we had a virtual pillow fight channel in Slack. At the time, the team was close enough. I would never recommend. In fact, one of my tips now is, like, never fight over text. However, the team was close enough, and it was the primary way that we spoke to each other on a day-to-day basis. So it felt more natural to argue over text. In that context, there was a high level of trust, and I could just say, "Ralph, I'm annoyed," right? I could just say it, and Ralph would know that that was not a reason to, it was just a starting of a conversation. So I didn't have to do nonviolent communication or, couch my words or anything. I could just state it. I wouldn't recommend that. But so one, agree on protocol. How are you going to behave? Two, I would say get training. Nonviolent communication. You cannot go wrong with learning nonviolent communication in any situation. There's also difficult conversations trainings. I've looked into this myself. I'm totally signing up, actually. I just got an email about it yesterday. And then the last thing I would also put is, it's important for leaders or Scrum Masters to understand what people need in order to feel connected on a team and how they deal with conflict. For example, my friend Abe, my closest friend in the world, Abe, when he does conflict, he has like an outburst, like a strong emotional, like roar, and then it's gone, totally gone. But like, if you don't know that about him, you could be very shocked by his outburst. But if you know that it's just like quick outburst and it's gone, and that's just Abe, that helps. So really understanding people and how they deal with conflict is also good. But I struggle with this.
Yeah, it's not easy because it involves our very core, right? Like the emotional reaction that is triggered by, whatever other people say, or we may think they think, whatever that may be. So it's definitely not an easy topic. And obviously, anyone who's married or on a long-term or in a long-term relationship knows that it isn't easy to handle conflict, even with people you know very well.
Exactly.
Right. And
exactly.
I think the tip about what's the protocol to raise up a topic you're not happy about, I think that would be a really great tip. And it's a great tip even for co-located teams, right? Like it's just that in remote work, you don't have the cues that tell you that Abe isn't really pissed. He just needs to vent a little bit. Right. But in remote work, you actually only read the text, or if teams, God forbid, have the camera off, and somebody says something, you don't see the grin or the wink. And then everybody thinks, and that's quite natural and predictable, everybody thinks about the worst case, right?
Indeed. And I have, it's interesting because I worked with Sergey, a mutual friend of ours, for years, and we had very different writing communication styles. He was very blunt and to the point and like completely logical. And so there was no reading between the lines. It was literally what he wrote is what he meant. And so you could take, as an American who's used to all kinds of smiley faces and exclamation points, you could read a lot into that or not. You had to really understand his communication style. So there's so much going on. There's going to be conflict. Having protocols and training yourself. And I remember once on the Management 3.0 team, we actually got an outside facilitator to come in and facilitate the conversation.
Absolutely. Getting help is obviously one of the things that we can do, especially for us as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches. We can ask other Scrum Masters and Agile coaches to come in and help facilitate the conversation so that we can remove ourselves and be more perhaps attentive to what is actually going on in the team. So, Lisette, we're almost ending here, but we've already mentioned the Super Kit as a handy resource. I'll put the link on the show notes, which Super Kit that includes team agreement, personal user manual, meeting agreements, etc. I'll also put the link to your book, Work Together Anywhere, and to your podcast, the Collaboration Superpowers podcast. But what is one resource that you would like to share with us that would help us, Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, and team leaders to become world-class leaders in a world where remote work might be the first choice, even if not always the choice?
Oh, man. So my answer was going to be the Super Kit because I have all this. So, but then I've already said the Super Kit. I hate to end the interview this way because I'm going to refer people to somebody else's resource. Please download the Super Kit. And I really think that one of the most important books that people can read right now is A World Without Email by Cal Newport. I think that is a really great resource for overcoming information overload and for agreeing with your team on protocols, redesigning your workflows in a way that makes them sustainable and that makes them less so that he has this term called the hyperactive hive mind. And I just think that this book is key to the remote world. So I'd love to toot my own horn, but I'll keep it real.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely put the link to all of those, the Super Kit, the podcast, the book, and of course, Cal Newport's A World Without Email book on the show notes. So
just imagine.
That in itself could be a whole new podcast episode for sure. Lisette, it's been a pleasure. Where can people go to find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, there's two websites. There's lisettesutherland.com. So that's all my personal things, if that's interesting. And then where I do all the work with other people that also love working remotely is collaborationsuperpowers.com. And that is me and a community of amazing facilitators hosting lean coffees, webinars, workshops. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. So I hope people will join us for that.
Absolutely. We'll put the link to those also on the show notes. Lisette, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you, Vasco. It's always fun to talk to you.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.